we ask the audience to mute their microphones, please, to make sure that we don't have any interference, and we can unmute them in the discussion part. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Yannis Hamilakis. I'm Zhukovsky Family Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Modern Greek Studies at Brown University. I'm also on the advisory board of Decolonize hellάş, and together with my colleagues Sisi Theodosiou and Vangelis Kalotihos, we convene the Nation and Race cluster of the Decolonize hellάş. Now, some of you will know that Decolonize hellάş was launched a couple of months ago, and the launch was timed to coincide with the public debates on the bicentenary of the 1821 Greek War of Independence. If this is your first Decolonize hellάş event, please go to the website to read more about it, and I'm going to share my screen so you can actually see the address of the Decolonize hellάş initiative. More importantly, go and share your thoughts and ideas on other initiatives that we may engage with. Briefly, Decolonize hellάş, as it says on its site, calls for an urgent reviewing of the place of modern Greece in relation to geographies and genealogies of European colonialism. The notions of racism and of colonization, variously conceived, are central in its thinking and the rationale of the initiative, which aspires to be a nomadic platform of academics, researchers, public scholars, artists, activists, and civil society that contributes to the global decolonize movement. Its activities are organized in 3 clusters. As I said, nation and race is one, but also memory and monuments, and cosmopolitanisms and cosmopolitics. Now, this event is co-organized with the Decolonial Initiative at Brown University, which was founded by Ariella Azoulay, Vazira Zamindar, and myself. This initiative seeks to bring together 2 trajectories of migration: the often forced migration of objects and the, again, often forced migration of people. As you can tell, artifacts, things, and monuments of different times are central to both initiatives. Some of us have been working on the social and political role of the Acropolis for years, but it is not accidental that Decolonize hellάş and the Decolonial Initiative have turned their attention first to an iconic monument, which is not only at the center of Western modernist imagination, but it has also played a key role in the construction of colonial and racialized modernity. As you'll hear tonight, the Western elites were not the only ones who took a keen interest on the site and invested it with their own ideas and interpretations. The Acropolis is again in the news in Greece and internationally due to the highly controversial interventions. Some of the panelists today have played a leading role in stressing the problematic character of these works. In my own interventions on the debate, I've called for a longer-term perspective. Our event tonight is the first of a broader initiative called Decolonizing the Acropolis. The current interventions, the ones that are being criticized, are part of a long history of colonization of the monument, first by the ideas of 18th and 19th century classicism, colonization which was as much about erasure as it was about recreating a past that never was, an ideal, white, non-neoclassical past, not a 5th century BCE one. But materiality has the annoying ability to resist. Things last. It is no accident that we call material traces remains. As you will see tonight, despite the 200 years of national purification, of cleansing, and of erasure, there are still plenty of remains, some on the ground and in storerooms, much more in the archives and in travel accounts. Some of these remains we've tried to rescue from erasure and oblivion through photographic means in the photoblog The Other Acropolis, for example. But a lot more needs to be done. And we're here today at an interesting juncture. Our presence here today is the outcome of a number of converging developments. The flourishing of Ottoman studies in Greece, the appearance of Ottoman archaeology in the country, the intensification of the debates on the role of the Acropolis and of monuments in general in the present. And finally, and thanks to social movements such as Black Lives Matter and the indigenous movement, the higher visibility that decolonizing thinking enjoys today, including in Greece. We've gathered today with us some of the most prominent Ottomanists around and other distinguished scholars who know the Acropolis more intimately than most. We've posed to them the following starting questions, although I'm sure the debate will raise many more issues. What do we know about the Ottoman Acropolis? What was the importance and the meaning of this landscape for the Ottoman imperial and local administration and for the inhabitants of Athens? How did the various visitors to the site react to the Acropolis as an Ottoman landscape? How much of that Ottoman material presence remains on site despite the 2 centuries of national purification? And finally, how can we make such a presence more widely known today? And now I would like to ask my co-convener of this event, Konstantinos Thanasakis, who is actually an Ottomanist unlike me, to present the speakers and also say a couple of things. I should also say before I give him the microphone that Konstantinos is the co-editor of this volume on Ottoman Athens, which is actually a volume that we have relied a lot, as you can see and as you will hear, for the presentations today. It's a great book, and if you haven't got it already, go and buy it or steal it or blackmail Konstantinos to send you a copy. So, Konstantinos, over to you.
Γιάννη, σε ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ καταρχήν για την πρόσκληση, για την όλη σκέψη γύρω από το θέμα και σε ευχαριστώ και πάρα πολύ για τα καλά σου λόγια για το βιβλίο. Είναι πραγματικά πολύ σπουδαίο κάποιος σαν και σένα να λέει τόσο ενδιαφέροντα πράγματα. Νομίζω ότι το Decolonize, ειδικά για την Οθωμανική Αθήνα και την Οθωμανική Ακρόπολη, είναι ένα καταπληκτικό πλαίσιο για να σκεφτούμε και να προβληματιστούμε. Okay, so apologies to our international audience for this. I just thanked Yannis about his kind words, his support and advertising the book. But I have to admit that it feels really great having someone like him praising Ottoman Athens. However, I have to confess that I'm not one of those prominent Ottomanists that he referred. I'm not an expert on Ottoman Athens and the Acropolis, and obviously I'm not here today to claim that we have discovered things that swipe whatever we knew this far. I guess that none of us is an expert in the sense that this is an ongoing process and more information is coming out. We keep learning about Ottoman Athens and Ottoman Acropolis, and we are always looking for new, fresh, and diverse interpretation and insights that hopefully and ultimately would lead us away from what the field has been bound to. When we started off with Maria Georgopoulou, the director of the Gennadios Library of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens and co-editor of the book, it was clearly part of our agenda to come out with a book that it works as a point of departure. The book obviously is not exhaustive, but I think that it is universal. It provides a bird's-eye view over Ottoman Athens, and it redefines, well, actually it defines the field. And this is what we are planning to do here today as well. I know that this sounds a bit over-optimistic, but let me explain what I mean. In reference to two obstacles we came across, each of which suggested that this is a no-go topic. For traditional scholarship, and quite expectedly, the Ottoman presence in today's Greece is in absentia. What do we have? Barbaric, militaristic, and little cultivated, the Ottomans just destroyed things. And that's it, period. Modern scholarship, on the other hand, also thought this topic a bit of a stretch. Can we speak of Ottoman Athens? Can we speak of Ottoman Acropolis? What is there to say about? Understanding Athens as a very small village of no importance, it was highly believed that the sources are so scarce that we cannot say anything about Athens and its monuments during the Ottoman centuries. We have to admit that there is some validity to the above. Athens wasn't, at least from the right beginning, an important center, although it was definitely not a small city. Once we put all bits together, and particularly those that recent scholarship wrote about, it becomes evident that we do have a valid case study and that the framework changes dramatically. For one, we have the monuments that are still standing, and we can somehow trace back their Ottoman history, even partially or in a roundabout way. We have plans, maps, floor plans, and accounts that, once seen comparatively, they start to reveal fascinating evidences, including silences. I believe that Tassos Fanoulas has something to say about this. Secondly, we have the flourishing field of Ottoman archaeology and architectural history, including inscriptions. Dimitris Loupis will guide us through. We also have written testimonies, West European accounts, but also intriguing Ottoman sources and manuscripts that as Elizabeth Fountain shows, challenge current perceptions. And finally, we have Ottoman documents. They shed new light upon things. Şükrü İlicak will explain more. So this is pretty much where we stand today, and that is why we are very much interested in things Ottoman. We desperately need new trajectories, even contradictory ones, that will at least permit us understand and reevaluate our perception of the monuments of the city. And it's here that I think that Decolonize Hellas provides a great opportunity to discuss the above and ultimately understand who or what was and perhaps still is subaltern. The Greeks, the Ottomans, or the monuments themselves. I won't speak more, I'll give the floor to our presenters. But before I do that, I would like to thank Natalia Klosa from Decolonize Hellas for helping us tonight with Zoom, and Culture Border Gender Lab, Εργαστήριο Μελέτης του Πολιτισμού των Συνόρων και του Κοινωνικού Φύλου, PAMAC, for hosting the event on their YouTube page. So we have first Şükrü İlicak, a Harvard graduate, currently at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies, Rethymnon, Crete. Şükrü has several publications on the Greek War of Independence, with most notable his recent work, now that is together with two of the most prominent scholars of Greek academia, Ilias Kolovos and Mohammed Tamhi, «Η οργή του Σουλτάνου, αυτόγραφα διατάγματα του Μαχμούτ Β το 1821, εκδόσεις Ελληνικό Ανοιχτό Πανεπιστήμιο». Of particular importance is his forthcoming and quite mammothal editorial work, which counts 1,600 pages, Those Infidel Greeks, the Greek War of Independence through the Ottoman Archival Documents, a 5-year research program that came very recently to an end. exclusively funded by the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation. The book will be out in September 2021 by Brill. Screw, I just Hellenized your name, Screw. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Thank you very much for the invitation. Tonight, I will explore several issues revolving around the Acropolis during the Greek Revolution, and I will use unearthed documents from the Ottoman State Archives in Istanbul and several British Foreign Office documents. Although many scholars have studied the organization and conduct of the Greek War of Independence, serious research based on Ottoman archival documents is extremely limited. This apparent lack of focus on the part of historians is even more curious, considering that almost 50,000 archival documents related to this singular event alone exist in the Ottoman State Archives. As such, Ottoman archival documents have much new information to offer on revolutionary Athens. The most important issue pertaining to Athens in the revolutionary period was, of course, its very possession. In the midst of the revolution, Athens, and more precisely the Acropolis, became the symbol of the Greek struggle for independence. The question of who would possess it came to acquire an importance to both sides of the conflict that was more moral and ideological than military and geopolitical. The answer to this question rested more and more on the discretion of the West European powers, as the forces of the Ottoman Ancien regime proved inefficient and untrustworthy allies in fighting the Sublime Porte's battles against the Greek insurgents. In the highly romanticized West European imagination of the early 19th century, the Acropolis became the bastion of the civilized world, and the war was fought between the imaginary descendants of Pericles and those of the barbaric ancient Persians. Official Ottoman documents not only reveal the perceptions and moral universe of Ottoman state officials, but also illustrate how ferociously this first clash of civilizations of the 19th century was fought. So, on receiving the news of the Greek uprising in the Morea and Livadia, about 1,200 Athenian Muslims sought refuge in the Acropolis, or the Athena Kalesi, namely the citadel of Athens, as the Ottomans called it. The insurgents immediately laid siege to the citadel. The earliest Ottoman document from revolutionary Athens that is preserved in the archives is a plea for help that was taken to Evia on June 28, 1821. Written by the deputy judge of Athens, Hacı Halil, the document reported that the insurgent Reaya of the neighboring villages entered the town on May 8th, quote, became of one heart and one mind with the local ecclesiastics and civilians, and began attacking Muslims. They killed the guards protecting the gates of the citadel, while the deputy judge himself fought against the rebels for 2 to 3 hours. The Muslims were forced to withdraw into the Acropolis, where the insurgents peppered them with bullets and bombarded them from Philopapu Hill. As was customary in public pleas, Islamic scholars, the sheikhs, the descendants of the Prophet, and the rich and the poor of the town all gathered in the courthouse to pen the petition, declaring that their numbers were minimal, whereas the Christians were too many. For this reason, they did not have the power to pursue them. They declared that they were in immediate danger and asked that soldiers be dispatched to rescue them. Upon the success of the Ottoman forces in Evia, Köse Mehmet Pasha, who was the governor of the Morea, was able to spare some troops to help save Athens. He dispatched Ömer Bey of Karistos and Ömer Vrioni at the head of light cavalry and musketeers. The Ottoman troops lifted the 83-day siege of the Acropolis on June 30th without encountering any resistance. They supplied the Athens garrison with enough food, water, and ammunition for a year. In his report to the Sublime Porte, Köse Mehmet Pasha did not forget to mention that the town was recaptured without inflicting any harm on its antiquities. The ancient monuments of Athens were very unlikely to have been a matter of personal concern to the Ottoman military governor. Yet he had strict instructions from Istanbul to preserve the antiquities at the request of the British ambassador, Percy Smythe, Viscount Frankfurt. In an attempt to save the quote, sacred monuments of antiquity with which that illustrious city abounds, from the fury of the Ottoman forces, end quote, Frankfurt took the initiative of applying to the Sublime Porte. In his letter, the ambassador clearly specified ancient Athens as the originator of modern European civilization, stating that, quote, the famous monuments of antiquity and masterpieces of art made this city the object of Europe's universal admiration for so many centuries, end quote. He also invoked his own king into the matter, George IV, who, quote, distinguished himself for his taste and commitment to science and literature, of which Athens was the cradle, would view this proof of a similar sentiment on the part of his old friend and ally, the Ottoman Emperor, with inexpressible satisfaction, end quote. It is not certain, however, whether at this initial stage of the revolution, the Ottoman administrators understood how the arts, sciences, and the Greek, Yunan, namely, philosophers of ancient Athens were connected with the current Romi, Reaya in the European imagination, or how this cultural legacy might affect the course of the revolution. At this point, they were preoccupied by the imminent prospect of a war with Russia. So only 5 days after the Russian ambassador's departure from Istanbul in protest against the Sublime Porte's maltreatment of its Greek subjects, the British ambassador was the last person the Ottoman administrators would risk offending. For this reason, Frankfurt managed to procure an imperial edict addressed to the Ottoman authorities in Athens, quote, recommending to their protection the various monuments of art and antiquity that were contained in that city, end quote. According to Frankfurt, quote, this proceeding was of a character quite unknown to the Ottoman government, and he was perfectly assured that it would never have consented to a demand so foreign to its usages and opinions, had it not been for the sincere desire of doing something that might be agreeable to his king, George IV of Britain. The edict instructed Köse Mehmet Pasha was as follows. As the perfect and sincere affection between the two courts had been increasing day by day, and as the antiquities and ancient monuments in Athens had always deserved the attention of Europe, it befitted the dignity of the Sublime Porte to take the necessary measures to retain these ancient monuments in their current state in order to do something agreeable to His Majesty King George. Thus, due to the sagacity which characterizes you, you shall order all those concerned to spare and preserve the antiquities and monuments in question, so that there should not be any complaint in this regard on the part of anyone. The patronizing monetary tone of these instructions was common in Ottoman edicts and thus not guaranteed to generate empathy on the governor's part. As it turned out, the Acropolis was in fact heavily shelled by both the Greek revolutionaries and the Ottoman armies in the following years. As soon as Ömer Vrioni departed from Athens after a 3-month stay, the scattered insurgents came down from the mountains and neighboring islands to lay a somewhat loose siege to the Acropolis. The rebels' attempts to take the citadel through open onslaught and surprise attacks proved unsuccessful until the scorching summer of 1822. Running out of water and with no help on the horizon, the besieged asked for the Sultan's permission to surrender the citadel. They surrendered the Acropolis before the arrival of the Sultan's permit, on the condition that the life and honor of every individual belonging to the garrison would be preserved and that they would be transported to some port of the Anatolian shores of the Aegean. So the Muslims laid down their arms and descended from the Acropolis. Here I use the term Muslim only nominally, since ethnic Albanians composed a sizable part of the town's Muslim population. Likewise, a considerable number of the Christians of Athens were also ethnic Albanians. According to French diplomatic reports, 800 people were besieged, 500 of whom were Albanians. Most of them were lodged in the former residence of the voivode, waiting for vessels to take them to safety. 18 days after the garrison surrender, on July 10th, a rumor reached Athens that the Ottoman army under Dramalı Mahmud Pasha had traversed the pass of Thermopylae and was advancing toward Athens. In Thomas Gordon's words, the more cruel and treacherous portion of the Athenian people and soldiery grew agitated and violated the terms of capitulation. Suddenly, Athens became the scene of mob violence, and its Muslim residents were massacred regardless of age or sex. The bibliography of sources for these events is ample. Depending on the source, the number of victims varies from 400 to 800. The remainder survived thanks to the strenuous efforts of the Austrian, Dutch, and French consulates, which provided shelter to hundreds of survivors before shipping them off to Izmir. In the 5 years that followed, despite the Sublime Porte's elaborate preparations on paper, the Ottoman military proved hopelessly incompetent in the field, and all efforts to recapture Athens bore no fruit. After the fall of Missolonghi in April 1826, Kütahi Reşit Mehmet Pasha's next mission was to capture Amphissa and Athens. The siege of the Acropolis began in the 3rd week of August. At this point, the antiquities of Athens became a diplomatic issue once again. In the summer of 1826, the ambassadors of the European powers took at least 2 actions for their preservation. Stratford Canning, the British ambassador to Istanbul since 1825, made the first attempt. Canning was credibly reported as saying that it was Reşit Pasha's intention, quote, to demolish the monuments of antiquity which still adorn the ancient capital of Attica under a fixed persuasion that those enduring records of the former glory of that country contribute in a great degree to render the present generation of Greeks discontented with the Turkish government, end quote. In order to make an effort for the prevention of so barbarous a design, in quote, he addressed a letter to Reşit Pasha. He also enclosed a copy of the imperial edict that had been sent to the governor of the Morea in 1822 at the request of his predecessor. Although I have yet to find an allusion to the destruction of the antiquities in Reşit Pasha's correspondence with the Sublime Porte, it is safe to assume, if the information gathered by Canning was accurate, that of all the Ottoman administrators, Reşit Pasha was the most aware of the ideological dimension of the war. During the siege, Ottoman administrators became well aware of the importance of Athens and Acropolis for the West Europeans, although this consuming interest in antiquities did not make much sense to them. While to the Grand Vizier, the antiquities of Athens were mere stones, and the attempts of the Western Europeans to preserve them represented only a reason for irritation. Reşit Pasha seems to have grasped the significance of both those stones and the association between the ancient Greeks and the contemporary Greeks better than his peers. He consistently reported that the Europeans' eyes were fixed on Athens and urged the Sublime Porte to take further measures to expedite the subjugation of the Acropolis before a possible European intervention. In any event, Canning informed the Ottoman Minister of Foreign Affairs about his endeavor, but he was not very hopeful that he would secure an edict this time. Quote, "In the present temper of the Turkish government, I do not expect to find any disposition in the Porte to repeat its former injunction in favor of an object which has ever been viewed by Turks, even of the higher class, with contempt or at best with indifference," end quote. In his letter to Reşit Pasha, Canning, just like his predecessor, underlined the importance of the antiquities for the friendly European courts, yet refrained from making references to ancient Greek civilization. He portrayed the monuments as works of supreme beauty in terms that were as neutral as possible. Quote, it is known to everyone that the citadel and suburbs of Athens contain the ruins of several antique edifices, which, though of small importance in the eyes of reason or of religion, and wholly unconnected with affairs of state, have justly fixed the admiration as works of consummate beauty and of perfect architectural skill. In the preservation of these buildings, which are so many memorials of the glory and magnanimity of the Turkish sovereigns who spared them for the benefit of posterity, the governments and nations of Europe, in friendship with the Sublime Porte, are known to take interest regarding them as models in architecture, whence many of the fairest ornaments of the European capitals have been derived, end quote. Affecting ignorance of the intelligence he had received, Canning preemptively put the blame of possible injury to the antiquities on common soldiery, while delivering subtle, flattering, and encouraging remarks to Reşit Pasha. In all armies, he said, of whatever country or of whatever religion, the common soldiery is little capable of appreciating such objects and operations of war, but too frequently involve the sacrifice of whatever is most beautiful in nature or admirable in art. The conduct of an army is, however, dependent on the will of its commander, and those commanders who have established the brightest and most enduring reputation for success in arms have, alas, been distinguished by their humanity and by their endeavors to mitigate the horrors and destructive consequences of war. Their preservation through the various events of the war will greatly redound to your Excellency's fame, and I am well convinced that no one will rejoice at it more than the gracious monarch whom I have the honor to serve as my sovereign and master, end quote. Canning's main argument was, however, that there was no feeling of national honor which could suggest to him the idea of their destruction. We do not know if Canning's reasoning aroused any sympathy in Reşit Pasha, since his response has not survived. The Pasha's reply to the French ambassador 2 months later exists, however, and exemplifies the mindset of the Ottoman administrators. Apparently, having heard about Reşit Pasha's designs of destruction, Count Guillemino, the French ambassador to Istanbul, also wanted to make an effort. He sent a letter to the Pasha with Admiral Henri de Rigny, who reached Athens in mid-August. In a verbal exchange, de Rigny asked the Pasha's permission to transfer, quote, the stones in the ancient monasteries, end quote, out of the Acropolis, offering a good amount of money to that end. In his return, Reşit Pasha dismissed the admiral, telling him that the Sublime State was not distressed for money and such a proposal was unprecedented. In his official response to the French ambassador, Reşit Pasha employed all the topoi and tropes developed by the Ottoman administration throughout the Greek Revolution. Although the Sublime Sultanate, the Ottoman state, had bestowed so many favors and much benevolence on them, the ungrateful Greeks raised the standard of revolt and declared war. They were devoid of intelligence and consciousness for entrenching themselves in such an artistically fashioned and beautiful place, and eventually bringing destruction both on themselves and on those such beautiful things, end quote. Finally, the Pasha stated that he gave orders for the preservation of the monuments only for the sake of the ambassador's friendship. To Rashid Pasha, all these diplomatic maneuvers were aimed at gaining time for the insurgents, and he shelled the Acropolis heavily. According to one count, in August 1826 alone, the Ottoman artillery discharged 2,120 cannonballs and 956 bombs and howitzer shells against the town and fortress. According to Rashid Pasha, the situation of the Acropolis was another reason for the prolonged siege. He reported that the citadel was not comparable to any other. Situated on a high, massive rock and with a strongly defended main fortress, shelling would not wound the besieged, and the infantry could not march into it. The rock beneath the citadel was as hard as flint. It could not be entrenched, and the sappers brought from Istanbul and Albania could not mine it. An imperial courier who witnessed the siege in January 1827 gave a similar account of the Acropolis. When we viewed from Filopapu, the citadel was on top of a massive rock half as tall as a minaret. Cannon fire was ineffectual, as it could not penetrate the walls of the citadel. Half of the walls were solid rock, and the other half were bonded masonry, but the stone walls and the rock appeared to be merged. The sappers dug 3 tunnels to mine the citadel, but because of the hard rock, mining proved ineffectual. Only mortars, which terrorized and frustrated the insurgents, proved powerful. Hiding behind the rock, the insurgents were invisible because of mortar fire. The vents of the insurgents' cannons were broken by frequent pushing and dragging, and their gunpowder turned into sand. With their resources and patience nearly exhausted and deprived of help by the failure of their comrades to attempts to raise the siege, the insurgent Greeks entered into negotiations for surrender. Rashid Pasha informed the Sublime Porte that he had to accept terms from the rebels in order to prevent a possible mutiny in his army. On June 6, 1827, Rashid Pasha reported that the citadel of Athens capitulated, asking for quarter, and, quote, its interior and exterior were cleared and purified from the filth of the brigands' bodies, which were filled with villainy, unquote. The insurgents left unharmed. The Acropolis remained under Ottoman control until March 31st, 1833. When the last Ottomans marched out of the Acropolis in little bands of 10 and 12 with dirty, ragged clothes, 2 richly caparisoned horses, a mule, and a man pulling a ram by the horns. This is a quote from a European traveler. Athens constituted one of the many fronts of what was known to the Ottoman administrators as the Greek sedition, Rum fesadı. But militarily speaking, it was not the most important one. Yet the course of events revolving around Athens was quite exemplary of the revolutionary years. Dehumanization of an indiscriminate violence toward the proverbial other, long and fierce sieges, and pervasive disrespect for historical and cultural heritage were all but commonplace on both sides of the war. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Subhi. That was great. Absolutely refreshing. Let's not ask questions right now and come back when we finish with all the presentations, I suggest. Yannis, do you agree with that?
I think the best. Yes, let's have all the talks and then we'll gather all the.
Yes, wonderful. So our next presenter is Tassos Stanoulas. Tassos Stanoulas was the architect in charge of the restoration of Acropolis from 1984 to 2010. Well, if there is one guy among us who does know the Acropolis, that is Tassos, and we are really looking forward to hearing what he has to say, and also elaborate more after we finish the presentations on the current debates about the Acropolis. Tassos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's very nice to be with you and talk with you after such a long time. So I hope that I would not disappoint you too much, because there is not much that exists now of from the Ottoman Acropolis. So the Ottoman occupation lasted on the Acropolis for almost 4 centuries. One would expect to have more vestiges surviving, but of course, very little, almost nothing is surviving. There are a few things which I will show you. I will not show you the inscription from the which was from the Thelikon and the vestiges from the cemetery. But anyway, I will show you a few things which are just walls, remains, traces of walls. Not much more has survived. So, and this is because also when the Acropolis was occupied by the Ottomans, it was always overbuilt, because you remember that it is a long story of accumulation of buildings on the Acropolis. So let me share the screen. So I might need your help now. Share screen. And what do I do? Yes. Sorry, share, yeah. And this, is that all right? Should I put it on the show? Is that all right for you? So I go to the beginning. I'm sorry. Here, this is the beginning. So the first slide is the model of the Acropolis from the West, as it was in the beginning of the Ottoman era. And in the end, we have a drawing by Yell, which is in the beginning of the 19th century. So it is towards the end of the Ottoman occupation. And we see that this is to plan and a view of the model of the Acropolis as it was in the classical times. Of course, it's not exactly classical, it is later, because whenever we make drawings or representations or models of the ancient Acropolis, it is of the later eras where we had all the, how to say, the richness of the accumulated classical architecture. And then in the post-Herullian times, the Acropolis was turned into a fortified citadel again. But the things that were done really were not much. So mainly it was the fortification of the west end of the Acropolis. Here we have this Roman staircase, which is planned to be rebuilt, unfortunately. I hope that it will not happen. And in the end, we have the Ballet Gate, which is the gate which was built after the Herullians were departed. And so we have this, the building of fortifications in this area, I mean, additions of the walls to become the walls for a fortress. And then we have this Ballet Gate, which is called like that after the archaeologists who uncovered it. And this is the south gate to the Acropolis from the west end. So, and so later, this is the end of the Acropolis in the 6th century, after the Justinian interventions on the building. This is the Justinian cistern behind the Propylaea. The lower part of it still survives, another cistern here, and some additions here. We attribute these buttresses to the Justinian era, and also we still have, this is the post-Herulian wall and a Justinian system below. In the late antiquity and in the Byzantine times, there were some changes also. We know that the Erechtheion and the Parthenon were turned into churches, and the northern wing of the Propylea here was turned into the palace of, or the residence of the Greek Orthodox Bishop of Athens. It is believed, let's say, or we think, that Michael Choniatis was living in here when he delivered the Acropolis to the Franks. And we have some additions here, floor, second stories added to the 3 towers of the west fortification. And then we have the Frankish period. The Franks, which occupied the Acropolis and Athens, of course, in 1304, contributed to the building of the Acropolis much more than all the Byzantines and maybe the late antiquity, because they decided to enhance the fortifications of the Acropolis according to the model which was developed in the Middle East through the amalgamation of the Crusaders, Byzantines, and Arab culture. We have the west end of the Acropolis as it was arranged by the Franks. We see the addition of the fortification of this of the Clepsydra spring, more additions in the west, this new precinct, which was fortified in front of the south gate. The west gate, the Belay gate, was closed, and so we have one entrance. So all the principles which were fortifying principles for which were developed for citadels in the Middle East were how to say accomplished here on the castle of the Acropolis. And now we can see some views, because what we have mostly from the Turkish period about the Acropolis is images and descriptions by the travelers, the Western travelers. And I mean, we see what existed in the Ottoman period, but much of it did not belong to them, as we can see from later evidence coming from the excavations from Cavadias Cavarau in the end of the century, and other, how to say, evidence which is written and photographed or drawn. So there is a beautiful and very important series of drawings by Gell in the beginning of the century. And these are this is a view of the Propylea from the western pediment of the Parthenon. This is a view of from the first bastion above the Belay gate, looking to the Propylea. And this is the Frankish bastion, which was built towards the end of the 13th century. And now this is a general plan. Here, the Acropolis as a Frankish castle. We have the 5 rings, 3 successive rings. At the foot, it is the, what later became called the Rizokastron. We have the ancient precinct of the Acropolis on top of the plateau and around the plateau. And the last precinct, fortified precinct, is the palace, which is organized in the Pinakotheki and to the east and north of the Pinakotheki. The Parthenon is still a church, while in the Frankish era, the Erechtheion became the residence of the metropolitan, because the Propylea became, the northern wing of the Propylea became the residence of the bishop, and then the Latin bishop had to go to the Erechtheion. What happened in the 15th century? So below, we have 2 of the very famous castles from Crusaders castles. This is to the right below is the Crac des Chevaliers, and to the left it is the Saranda Colonies in Cyprus. And well, sorry, no. And to the end, we see that what the Archaeology, the last Westerners who occupied the Acropolis before it was delivered to the Turks, to the west end, they only arranged the extension of the palatial area from the area around the Pinakotheki, the northern wing of the Propylea, to the north of the central building, into the central building. And so you see that in this plan, the entrance to the Acropolis is in the south end of the Propylea, to the south of the south wing of the Propylea, while here the entrance is still through the Propylea. And we can see it more in detail here, but also we can see this axonometric drawing, which shows the arrangement of the Acropolis as a castle with a palatial, with a palace of the Archaeology, which is really a very beautiful and very big and very luxurious Renaissance Quattrocento palace in the Florentine style. So this was what the Turks took from the Acropolis, how the Turks found the Acropolis when they took it. Sorry, and now I have to see my notes because I have forgotten to look at them. Throughout the long period, which ended with the Greek War of Independence, the most important change, I mean, starting from the Franks, starting from late antiquity to the end of the Turkish occupation, the most important change for the Acropolis was that it was deprived of its openness by acquiring military characteristics, especially in the west slope. That provided the only negotiable access to the plateau. This did not so much influence the volume of the monuments on the outside, but it seems that the ambience changed deeply because of the new functions which were installed inside the buildings and around the buildings. The effects were most conspicuous between the classical monuments through the loss of monumentality and artistic character, since the works of art, which were the offerings and lesser buildings in antiquity, were replaced by structures with very little or no aesthetic value, much of which was simple housing. This is, of course, a modern evaluation of the, and under the perspective of the humanist studies which were developed after the Renaissance. Sometime between 17 and 1738, well, we see a few pictures, two drawings from the beginning of the 19th century showing details from the Acropolis. This is a view from of the Parthenon from the south, southwest. Do you hear me? Yes, you hear me.
Yes, yes, yes, that's weird.
Okay, okay. Above is a model of the Acropolis as it was around 1500, and below we see two pictures from which show this elegant arcade on the south, which, and this is supposed what would be a kind of building related initially to the Parthenon. There is some evidence from the Byzantine times. And because we have these arches here, which are pointed, and of course we know that the Turks also built the pointed arches too. But so it is evidence which cannot be trusted. We cannot date what we see in the drawings, in the views from the Ottoman era on the Acropolis, without taking into consideration the archaeological, how to say, evidence which is provided by the excavations and other things in the 19th century, which unfortunately is very poor because whatever was not classical did not care for reporting correctly. We go now to, this is to the right, you see above, you see a section in the central building of the Propylaea as it was arranged by the Archaeology. You see that the lower part of the building, the classical building, the core of the classical building is entered from the east. We have the those beautiful vestibule, which is described by Syriac of Ancona, and here this is the Salone of the Duke or Prince Nerio, and above private apartments which are built by the, they were added by the Acciaioli. And then we have, you see that we have gunpowder. The major disasters in the Acropolis was caused by the gunpowder. And the first is in the Propylaea, 1640. I mean, you see that the Dizdar of the Acropolis was living in the apartments above the central building, and the low part was used as gunpowder magazine. This is also recorded by Liatzelembi. Not that the residence of the Dizdar was above, that this building was used as to ground gunpowder by the Turks. And so in 1640, thunder fell on and caused the explosion and blowing up of the gunpowder and blowing up of the Propylaea. And we see what remained after the explosion until the end of the 1700, because we have a report by a French logbook dated October 1699, which reports that the west pediment and the western facade of the palace was still in place. And it is only sometime in the first half of the 18th century, when the Turks decided to repair the fortifications, that they took down what was remaining of the superstructure in the west end, built it in the area of the Thanasakis temple, and installed these barrel vaults in the central building to raise the floor. And this was again for war technology, because they wanted to install a new battery of cannon in the Propylaea, and they wanted to raise the level of the battery of cannon in order to have a better range. And so we see that again, demolitions are due to the war always, and to the gunpowder. But now, then in 1687, we have the explosion in the Parthenon, and it is real, something which I have already said years ago, that after all, the Venetians, when they bombed the Parthenon, they already called it the temples, or the temple of Pallas, Tempio di Pallade or Pallade. And they did it because they wanted to deprive the Turks from the battery, from the gunpowder. And what was caused was a huge ruination of the Parthenon and death and ruination all over the Acropolis. This is described very vividly by a German officer, Tse, who visited the Acropolis one of the next days after the explosion in the Propylaea. And that's why sometimes we must be careful whom we accuse for the ruination of our monuments. Let's see a few more pictures, let's say, to show you what still survives in situ. We'll see mostly drawings, and again, we have these views in the propylaea, which we saw before. And also here I have added this beautiful drawing, the plan by Haller von Hallerstein, 1810, which shows the arrangement of the fortifications arrangement in the west end of the Acropolis. We see the barrel vaulting in the propylaea. We see the plan and the room sections in the Pinakotheki, the so-called Frankish tower. I have no doubt that this is a Florentine tower, but for the Greeks or the Westerners are Franks. And we have these bastions which were built, I mean, underneath it is the Belegate, but they are sheathed by this mantle, huge mantle for the installation for the battery of cannon, the westernmost battery of cannon, which was the first to be installed, and also which thickened the fortifications to resist artillery. And these are Turkish things. They must have been done very early, and also some other things in this area. I'll show you, this is later, this is a construction of 1805, when the Turks added, repaired this area, and they added this bastion above the extension of the bastion which covered was covering the Belegate. And this is another thing which survives above. We see those architectural members, most of them come from the propylaea. Many of them are coffers from the ceilings, and also some other come from the Parthenon and the Erechtheion, and they must be built in there. So this is some Turkish. This is certainly Turkish because it is built with architectural members, which became disiecta membra after the explosion of the two explosions on the Acropolis in the 17th century, 1640 and 1687. All this material became available and it was built here almost certainly between 1700 and 1738, in a period when the Turks decided to repair the Acropolis walls. We say that the last the term for this thing is 1738, because we have the only written evidence by Lord Sandwich, who visited the Acropolis then, and we have the changes which were caused after 1700.
Tassos, apologies for interrupting you. You have 2 more minutes, if you don't mind.
Yes, of course. And I'm finishing. And some more things, more details, which will could help us for also another drawings for restoring the propylaea in the beginning of between 1750 and 1733. And also we have graffiti, which is something, we have Greek graffiti from the period 1822, 25, 27. We have 3. But the Turkish graffiti, we have Turkish Arabic, we have only 3, and they are in the Pinakotheki area. And it is not improbable that they can be Arabic older, because the one was found after the demolition of a Frankish plaster. So the 1, 2, 3. Oh, no, yes, 1, 2, 3. This is the 3rd one. And more vestiges, drawings, which we can see the remains, very few remains of what I showed you before and described before. And this is the end of the presentation. And now I want to say a few words about what do we understand today but the term decolonization and also regarding the Acropolis, to my understanding, is a challenge against the stereotypes which were imposed on the Greeks while they were trying to build a modern Greek national identity, according to the stereotypes that were predominant in Europe in the first half of the 19th century. These concepts promoted the classical identity for the Greeks and their monuments. In the course of the 19th century, this caused the almost complete elimination of the remains of post-classical buildings, including a big number of Byzantine churches. On the Acropolis, practically everything that was post-classical was removed. The only parts which can be almost fully perceived are the four major monuments. Nevertheless, the present situation, the Acropolis is a historic phase on its own, as it is the result of cleanings and excavations between 1833 and 1890, followed by the restoration work under Palamas, Orlando, and so on. The site between the major monuments is still still full of tangible traces of the historic phases prior to or later to the classical one. These traces must be there, accessible, and as tangible evidence of a past that has been irrevocably lost. The recreation of the landscape between the Parthenon, the Propylea, and all these buildings, including the classical landscape, can be restored only in theory and become accessible to the public by means of models, real ones or digital ones, and the exploitation of modern digital technology. In this way, much of the Ottoman phase of the Acropolis can be restored by taking into consideration the descriptions and images from the travelers, mostly the ones from Western Europe, which were equipped with more scholarly and technical knowledge by both Greeks and Turks. Considering that the most substantial building activity on the Acropolis took place before the Ottoman occupation, it is usually difficult to tell what was built by the Turks and what pre-existed. Certainly, there were additions and repairs, but also a ruination too, which is an obstacle to find out what is true. In this procedure, decolonization means for me objectivity in the preservation of the diachronic unity of the archaeological sites and monuments. Thank you. I was too long?
No, that was okay.
Thank you.
That was fine, actually. Thank you very much for the presentation. And now we're moving ahead with Elizabeth Fountain, a historian and senior researcher at the Faculty of Classics, University of Cambridge. Elizabeth is working on the Parthenon Mosque, among many other things. I believe that she's preparing a long publication on this topic, and a new topic, the Olympion, which is coming out next year. So Elizabeth, the floor is yours to tell us more about the fascinating manuscripts you are working on.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Am I unmute? Because I can't actually see myself.
We can hear you very well.
Right. Good. Thank you. Just so, because I know we want to leave time for discussion. So I just want to thank you, Yannis and Konstantinos, enormously for this fantastic initiative that, as I can see by the people who are attending, and hopefully will look at it when it's recorded on the site, it's a very exciting time for Greek Ottomanists and Turkish Byzantinists and Hellenists to come together. And I think that we should view the erasure and the forgetting of this Ottoman period as a great opportunity, the fragmentation of really important collaborative work, because we all have our own angle from which we're viewing, and you really need to bring everything together, I think, to tackle this long Ottoman period. So with that as my thank you introduction, I will now begin, not reading too fast. Long before Europeans expressed their disappointment in the sad relic of ancient Hellas that they found in contemporary Greece and identified themselves as the true heirs of ancient Greek wisdom, Muslims of West Asia had been in dialogue with Greek writings. This was in large part thanks to the Greco-Arabic translation movement that began in 8th century Baghdad and was later inherited by the Ottomans. The impact of this inheritance on Ottoman views of Athens and the Acropolis is a dimension of the city's history open to further exploration, especially given the tendency to focus on the long 19th century. In the early Ottoman tradition, the ancient monuments of Athens were peopled with Greek wise men, but also with prophets from the Quran. Athens, known in Arabic and Ottoman as the city of the sages, was the stage on which prophetic legend, philosophical biography, and public architecture met. In this presentation, I'll focus on 3 Ottoman admirers of the city of sages, bearing in mind the role of the historian, that's what I am, to help us understand what was imaginable in a given moment. We're told by 2 contemporary historians who wrote in Greek that in late August 1458, Mehmed the Conqueror made a 4-day visit to Athens to commend the city's peaceful takeover and admire its antiquities. This was only 2 years after the city had been newly incorporated into his empire, and 5 years after he had prayed in Hagia Sophia to seal its conversion to a mosque. 2 later Ottoman sources refer to the Parthenon Mosque as the Mosque of the Conqueror, and describe in some detail Mehmed's visit to the Acropolis and his conversion of the ancient temple, then of course a church, into a sultanic foundation with provisions for its staff and upkeep. The Sultan's taste for Greek learning is well known, and the conjecture that on his visit to Athens he had his tent pitched near the place known as Plato's School comes as no surprise. Athens had a prestige among cultivated Ottomans similar to that of Constantinople or Jerusalem, cities whose fame was grounded in their pre-Islamic past, unlike the Islamic foundations of Mecca, Medina, or Baghdad. This is a viewpoint the Ottoman elite shared with educated Europeans, as is beautifully illustrated by the career of Louis XIV's ambassador to the Sublime Porte, the Marquis de Noailles, who was based in Constantinople but traveled widely. He employed artists to boost his reputation, both at the Ottoman court and back in Paris, by depicting his doings not only in Constantinople, but also in Athens and Jerusalem. This Jerusalem picture was discovered in 2019 during the redecoration of a Parisian boutique. Similar in its foregrounding of the noble Marquis against a spectacular city view is the Athens painting, now hanging in the Museum of the City of Athens. This is the earliest accurate depiction of the city and the minareted Parthenon. Besides the Parthenon, the Olympion and the Theseum, antiquities are not exactly center stage in this depiction. Instead, we see what Alexandros Papadimandis was later to evoke as Athens as an Oriental city, the title of an essay rather provocatively written for a volume celebrating the revival of the Olympic Games in 1896. Noailles was one of the very earliest European visitors to Ottoman Athens and is well known because of another artist in his entourage who sketched the Parthenon sculptures just 14 years before Morosini's attack in 1687, which we saw depicted. But if Noailles, or at least his artist, saw Athens as it was, the growing numbers of European visitors who came after him tended to reduce the contemporary Athenian cityscape and population to merely decorative roles, highlighting instead the classical monuments to serve as templates for architectural and artistic production back in Europe. But what of local Ottoman residents, whether Muslim or Christian, or Ottoman travelers? How did they perceive Athens? The most famous, garrulous, imaginative, and entertaining of all Turkish travelers, Evliya Çelebi, visited Athens just 6 years before Noailles in 1668. his Athens is absolutely the city of sages. He even imagines the philosophers of Athens and Baghdad in telepathic communication with each other and sees traces of their alchemical experiments in the caves at the citadel's base. But in Evliya's vision, Athens and surrounding Attica are also embedded in another narrative, an Abrahamic and specifically Quranic history in which King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, Belkis, are associated with the Temple of Poseidon at Sunium, the quarries at Pandeli, and the Temple of Olympian Zeus. Evliya also informs us that the dome, perhaps he means the apse, of the Parthenon collapsed on the night of the Prophet Muhammad's birth, drawing the Athenian building into the well-known Islamic tradition concerning the fate of great pre-Islamic monuments at that pivotal moment in prophetic time. Inside the Parthenon, which Evliya thought was the most beautiful mosque in the whole world, you could admire various wonders, including the marble throne from which Plato used to teach. One wonders whether what Evliya saw is the same throne found on the Acropolis and exhibited today in the new Acropolis Museum. In contradiction to the modern assumption of Islamic iconophobia, Evliya is enthusiastic in his description of the figures depicted on the mosque, though unsurprisingly, he seems not to distinguish clearly between the Christian painting and the pagan sculpture. Another less known Ottoman source is an early 18th century religious scholar called Mahmud Effendi, who had family in Chalkida, Thebes, and Athens, though it is unclear in which of those cities he was born. Mahmud wrote a book entitled The History of the City of Sages, from his own day all the way back to Adam and Kekrops, so again combining the Abrahamic and the classical strands of history. This work is still very little known and cries out for funding to make possible a collaborative edition, translation, and multifaceted study of an Athenian Muslim who drew on local oral history, ancient Greek and Latin texts translated for him by local Christian clerics, and Islamic history, in order to create a truly synthetic and powerfully integrated history of Athens and its monuments. Like Evliya Çelebi, Mahmud mentions that ancient philosophers are associated by local people with ancient buildings, such as the Tower of the Winds and various buildings on the Acropolis that were their schools. Mahmud's history features a remarkable example of this Abrahamic classical synergy I keep on emphasizing, in the shape of a story to the effect that Pericles decided to build the Parthenon in order to help the people of Rumeli and save them the arduous pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In other words, Mahmud parallels Pericles with King Solomon and imagines the Parthenon as a surrogate holy place for the Jerusalem temple. This is just one example of Mahmud's attempts to explain ancient Athenian history and monuments interpreted in a way that made them meaningful in the contemporary Muslim Greek context. We should not overlook, though, that in Mahmud's day, the Parthenon that had served with only slight alterations as temple, church, and mosque was a ruined field, damaged beyond repair. By the middle of the 18th century, a small Ottoman-style mosque had been built amidst the ruins, oriented on Mecca, so at an angle to the temple's axis. This building survived in its last years as an antiquity store with a statue of Apollo set in the mihrab until 1843, when it was cleared away with basically no archaeological record. It's extraordinary that Evliya and Mahmud figure so little in the study of interest in and travel to early modern Greece, which remains thoroughly Eurocentric, but not colonial in the strict sense, since in Greece the Europeans were visitors, not colonists, unless, of course, we mean colonists of the Greek imagination. But would Muslims born and bred in what would become the Hellenic Republic, what would they have thought of themselves as colonists? They belonged to the place and interwove their own cultural heritage and religious beliefs and practices with those of the Greeks, going back even to pre-Christian times. We need to keep exploring the multiple reasons why, since 1821, Muslim Greece has been excised or ignored, and why a singular symbolism of a holy rock crowned by a glorious temple raised by a democratic polity remains so strong and convenient, however much it may distort historical reality, making it deceptively linear. It also bears continued reflection that the Parthenon has successfully been a temple for a millennium, a church for a millennium, a mosque for almost 4 centuries, and a secularized, purified archaeological site for almost 2 centuries. A functional stratigraphy hard to parallel anywhere else in the world, but well able to serve as a symbol of the multicultural Europe now emerging. If there is understandable sensitivity in Athens to the increasingly strident neo-Ottomanist pretensions of the current leadership in Ankara, with its appetite for asserting cultural sovereignty over Ottoman monuments beyond the Turkish Republic, it might not be such a bad idea for us to stake a claim to Greek Ottoman heritage as an integral part of what makes Greece the country it is today, enriched by and confident in its complex past, instead of considering the Ottoman phase as alien. This meeting and others like it that consider the dynamic role of archaeology in not just ossifying the past, but reflecting our vision for the future can bear fruit in collaborations to create new signboards, guides to the Byzantine, Frankish, and Ottoman Acropolis that allow the visitor to reimagine life in those periods. I'd be delighted to work with an artist to create depictions of the Parthenon as described by Evliya and Mahmud Effendi. But I would especially like to see a lively history for the wider public of the debates that have raged in Greece for 200 years about how the Acropolis should be presented. The current debates are part of a long tradition about who we are and what messages we want the Acropolis to convey to the world. The new Acropolis Museum could add to its models one showing the Ottoman Acropolis, since it now stops with the Parthenon Church. And the recreation of the old Acropolis Museum on top of the rock could offer us the chance to present an alternative yet complementary narrative to what the visitor sees outside, a narrative or narratives that give the visitor some sense of the generations of Christian and Muslim Athenians who created their own ways of using and understanding these glorious marble monuments from the past. The historian Yannis has aptly commented that we have made the fascinating mess of the pre-1812 period too neat. The beautifully crooked lines to 1821 and to 2021 too straight. If the historian's role is to convey what was imaginable in a given moment, I would like future historians to look back at this given moment as one of capacious imagination for all that this holy rock has been and can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so much. This was a great presentation. One thing I can guarantee that after this talk, we will all be buying your books ASAP. Thank you very much.
So, Mosque. We want to see it in the Acropolis Museum. Thanks.
So next we have, last but not least, Dimitris Loupis, historian, PhD candidate, Harvard University. Dimitris has worked extensively on Ottoman cartography and Ottoman architectural history. And one thing that characterizes him is that he is the pioneer of the field, not only Ottoman architecture, but Ottoman history in general. He has been a source of inspiration for all of us. He's of course quite young, but he started young. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me. Okay. I would like to thank the organizers of this event for their kind invitation to join the panel. And since I'm last, I'll try to finish my presentation quickly. The Ottomans conquered the town of Athens, governed then by the Florentine Azzaioli in 1456.
Sorry, Dimitri, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
There's a noise in the background. Is it possibly?
A noise?
Yeah, there's a, yeah.
Oh,
No, it's
okay.
better. Okay.
Air
Okay.
conditioning. Okay.
Okay, good.
So while the Acropolis surrendered in 1458, immediately an Ottoman garrison was established there in order to secure the Ottoman sovereignty in the town and its area. According to the early surviving tax register, 78 soldiers lived in the Acropolis in 1506. They were 83 in 1521 and 114 in 1540. At the same time, in the middle of 16th century, Athens had a population of almost 18,700 people, and according to the Ottomanist Hamilakis, it was the third most populated settlement in the Balkans after Adrianople and Thessaloniki. The Byzantine Church in Parthenon became Catholic under the Florentines, and the Ottomans turned it to a mosque in the name of Sultan Mehmed Fatih, who visited and admired the city in 1458. Historians Chalkokondylis and Critopoulos make a reference to that. The warden of the castle, his soldiers and their families were the only ones allowed to enter the Acropolis. Anyone else needed permission. The free space between the Parthenon, Erechtheum, and the Propylaea is used for their houses, to which narrow streets led. The Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, who was mentioned by other speakers already, visited Athens in June or July of 1668 and mentioned that there were 300 tiled roof houses, a rather high number to be accepted as real. These houses were described as fortress-like structures of two layers. There were no gardens, while people gathered raining water in cisterns. During summer, donkeys carried water up to the rock. Evliya Çelebi admired the ancient sculptures of the Parthenon Mosque and mentioned that there was a powder magazine at the Propylaea, a space for visitors, most probably for moving soldiers, and a small masjid for those in service at the gate. The agricultural production of Attica in 16th century allowed the prosperity of Athens, which during the rest of the Ottoman era was an Ottoman Balkan city of low to middle interest for the empire. The Ottoman map of Athens, dated in 1827, and this is a detail of it, depicts the Parthenon Mosque, the Erechtheum, which is called Belkıs Sarai, the palace of Queen of Sheba, several cisterns, towers, gates, warehouses, a water tower, a mill and a pounder magazine on the Acropolis. This is a proposed reconstruction of the Acropolis during the Ottoman times with the first mosque. This is before the bombing of Morozini. And here is the second mosque, the smaller one, after the 1687. Thanks to a few album and photographs of mid-19th century, we have we can see some remains of these of the buildings of the Ottomans. I don't know if my pointer can be seen. You can see here a building which was kept by the Archaeological Service at that time in order to use it as a depot for the antiquities. So this is actually a house used by the Ottomans on the Acropolis. And then around the early 50s, you can see where the houses of the Acropolis found their place. All these three areas, the heaps have all the marbles, the stones that was used by the houses, the Ottoman houses. Nowadays, what remained out of the Ottoman presence on the Acropolis? There is a graffiti that Dr. Tanula showed us before. One of the graffiti that was shown by him is in the so-called Pinakotheki at the Propylaea. What I'm not sure whether it is an exact, exactly written word or just a try to write something in Arabic. I can see Elif Lam, that is the Arabic article, but nothing more than that. And then, of course, this a long inscription of a bastion on the Acropolis, which was made by the voivoda of Athens, Mustafa Effendi, in the year 1708 to 1709. Now this inscription I hear is moved to a depot of the Archaeological Service. And among the other remains, which most probably was found among the stones and things that I showed you before, it's a marble fountain in the memory of Fatma Khatun, daughter of the castle warden Ebu Bekir Agha, which is dated in 1741. This was on the Acropolis. My main object, the main topic of my presentation is the cemetery, the Ottoman cemetery on the western slope of the Acropolis, and this is where I'm going to go now. You can see here on the map of Athens, you can see this area. There is no inscription, nothing mentions the cemetery or the burials, but this is how the map maker depicted this area, which is divided by this dirt road that leads to the entrance of the Acropolis. There is a series, quite a long series of engravings or drawings that depict the buildings, the burial site of the slope. Here is quite an early one, dated in the first half of 18th century, and this was made by Admiral Raben, a Danish admiral, and who gave the title Veduta della Fortezza di Atene della parte di Garbino, and it is nowadays in the Royal Danish Library. We will see a detail in a few minutes. This is where the burial site is. And then another one by Gell. Gell was mentioned already. This is a drawing from the British Museum. You can see here the burial buildings. Another one by Thürmer. He was an architect, and together with his friend Hübsch, visited the area and depicted the slope of the Acropolis. And you can see here that Hübsch is more accurate in the depiction of the buildings. He gave in a more accurate way the details of these buildings. Of course, Dupré has his own engraving that depicts the area, and then another print of Dupré with the same topic. Stewart and Revet, of course, they depicted the western slope of the Acropolis and the buildings. And then another publication by Rudi Züchli in Basel, dated in 1870, gives a depiction of the area. Nuttall and Craig made this engraving as well. And there is another engraving by Clark, the famous traveler. We can see here a baldachin mausoleum, and then Dodwell in his watercolor that is now in this Packard Humanities Institute in California. Of course, Leroy in 1758 depicted this building, which is considered a Turkish burial, and I'm going to discuss about the building later. And Sayer, who copied Leroy, made this engraving a year after the original. And finally, Pomardi, who put his lens closer to the buildings, give us, I think, the most detailed depiction. Let me use the Pomardi engraving in order to discuss the varieties of Ottoman Islamic burials we have in this case. There are simple tombstones just put without putting in the soil with nothing else. Of course, we have something like this, which is more elaborate. There is a built frame here and two holes in order to put the head stone and the other tombstone here. We have as well family burials. You can see 3 tombstones that belong to the same family. And then we have 2 sarcophagi in this area, actually pseudo-sarcophagi. The burial is here. And finally, we have this big mausoleum where a dervish was buried. What remained out of all this cemetery is was, and I think it still is, in a pile of marbles in a very dangerous place to visit. I remember when I visited the area, you can see here how it's very steep, and I managed to take pictures of all this, the material many years ago. I saw you here some of these pictures, and then the headpieces of the burials and some other stones. Again, a variety of the headpieces. And finally, a piece of an old marble, which was used, an ancient marble, which was reused for an Ottoman sarcophagus, which is in the area, in another collection of marbles. And another tombstone, which was moved from the area, and it is protected now by the American school. A tombstone of Hussein Beshe, Ibn Ibrahim Beshe, a Janissary who passed away in 1774 to 75. I think that the road divides the cemetery into 2 areas: the lower area, which is the southwest area, and the upper area, which is the west area. In the lower area, there is a number of 2 or 3 mausolea of this sort, and then in the western area, the upper area, the most important building is the mausoleum of the dervish. You can have an idea of the lower part and the 3 main mausolea, the Turmer engraving, and then Hughes has in details these 3 buildings here. You can clearly see that they are not alike. They have different features. Dupré depicts 2 of these buildings, and then 3 are depicted here by Dodwell. In Clark's engraving, I mentioned the Baldachin form burial, which is not depicted in any of the other engravings, and an equivalent we can see now in Iznik in Turkey. It's the Sarısaltık mausoleum. There are several of them. There were many in Greece and the Balkans. And then through this very detailed engraving, we can see again details of the buildings. And here, I think we can have a better idea. And I would like to show to you a burial of a dervish, which was very close to the Fethiye Mosque and the Tower of the Winds, as you can see. The photograph dates back to 1895. So this is a two-chambered building. The burial is here in the main building, and this is an entrance area. An extant building of this sort is the Kütüklü Baba Mausoleum in Selin, Oxanthi, which is dated in early 15th century. Again, you can see the burial chamber, which is elevated, and then the hall, which was built in front of one of its gates. And then here by Gel, we can see a building like this, which is a cube with a dome, and has two openings on every side. I think we can see an equivalent here in Feres, in northern Greece, the Ibrahim Baba Mausoleum. Again, it's a cube with two openings on not all the sides, but the two sides of it. And then through the Stuart Revet engraving and the Craven drawing, which is in the British School of Athens. Actually, you can see here this building with the two windows on each side. And this octagonal burial building, which I think it's very close to the Musa Baba Mausoleum of Thessaloniki, which is an extant building and recently very nicely restored. On the other side, the big building, which is depicted here. And here again, although my digital copy is not good enough, here, better, I can see a building which gives emphasis to its vertical axis. It is domed and it has a portico. Again, we can see it here and here and here as well. Here with some detail. Again, here and here. I can see a semi-dome, which is depicted in several of the engravings. Here, Hughes, being an architect, gives another idea of the formation of the drum of the dome, which is not again depicted in any other case, and the romantic and dramatic version of this building is given here by Leroy and Sayer. We can see here that old columns, ancient columns, are used in order to support the portico. And finally, Pomardi, which gives a far better idea of the building, which is the Halveti Teke of Hussein Effendi. And this is what Evliya Çelebi mentions in his Seyahatname. I use here the original text, his original manuscript, and not the last publication because it has a mistake in the date given here. So according to what Evliya Çelebi says, we have this information about the Teke. And walking 100 steps down from this gate, there is the Teke of Hussein Effendi, a great threshold of felicity. This means dervish convent of the Halveti order. This is the chronogram over its gate. Thus said Mahdemi, its chronogram, let that munificent man is accepted by God. The date is 1615 to 1616. And then Mahdemi was the poet who wrote the chronogram. And again, Evliya Çelebi does not give us the whole of the text of the inscription. He gives us only the lower part of it. I can find the equivalent of this building, which has a cubic or rectangular burial area, and then a portico, which is most of the times tiled roof. Here is the Melik Ahmed Denishment Gazi Mausoleum, dated in 16th century. It is in Niksar, Neokesaria, in Turkey. And then Turhan Bey Mausoleum and Mosque, dated in late 15th century, near Uzunköprü in Turkey. It was very recently renovated. I have to say it is a very heavily restored building. You can get an idea of the mosque, the small mosque here. It resembles the building, the Teke of the Halveti Teke of Athens. And then a functioning Halveti Teke, which was built in 1728 in Berat, Albania. It has the same main building, and in front of it, this the portico. And this is it. This is all we have from archaeological remains and texts. I guess more is to be found. And hopefully that slowly we can reshape the life of the Ottomans on the Acropolis and on the slopes of the rock. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dimitris, very, very much.
Thank you, Dimitri, for this fascinating talk, and thank you to everybody for giving such an amazing overview of the Ottoman Acropolis. I think it's fair to say that a lot of what you have said today, you cannot find in many other sources. A lot of it is work in progress. A lot of it is going to come out in publications and books and articles in the years to come. But we have some time and would like to discuss. I just wanted to say two things before we open it up to questions. The first is that I hope you can see, we can all see the title, why we chose as a title, Entangled Biographies. You could see how both in Elizabeth's presentation, but also in other presentations, how we have a constant dialogue, a dialogue between the existing monuments of, let's say, classical or even pre-classical era, and then the constant stream of visitors of different faith, of different culture, of different religion, who actually try to make sense, creating a palimpsest, creating an amalgam of different interpretations and different ideas. As for the second part of our talk, shared heritage, that's what we want to achieve. That's what we want to aspire to actually see this not as a nationalized, purified heritage, but as a global heritage, to be true to the actual declaration of the monument as a monument of universal heritage, universal culture. I have lots and lots of questions. I want to start by asking only one, I think, and go back to our first speaker, to Shukru. And I want to ask him about all these documents from British and French diplomats, ambassadors, and others, and try and think of it as an archival fact, as a kind of document that creates certain conceptions in the actual record, in the historical record. As you said, Shukru, I hope Shukru is still with us. As Shukru said, some of these documents were patronizing in many ways. They were actually also doing a work of appropriation. They were positing these figures as the protectors of the classical heritage of Greece and of Athens, whereas they were projecting and they were portraying Ottomans in general as the potential distractors of the monument. So as we have seen, there have been distraction from all sorts of parts, and there was also lots of recreation, lots of building. And in fact, most of the people who actually inhabited the rock accumulated stuff. built upon, modified, creating the palimpsest that it was. And it was the nationalized culture of the Acropolis and the purification that started by erasing. The main job of national archaeology was erasure. The main job of most of the people who came before was building upon, recreation, adding on as opposed to taking things away and destroying. So I don't know whether Shukru, you want briefly to comment on that? You know, what kind of work that these documents do?
Sorry, my dog was distracting me. Can you?
Sorry, I was saying that these documents, I was trying to invite you to do a kind of a second reading of these documents by diplomats and ambassadors, Canning and others. So you have the information content, but also you have an attempt to portray them as protectors of the Acropolis and also depict the Ottomans and others as potential, people who are going to destroy them. So I describe this as a process of appropriation on their part. And I don't know whether you have any thoughts on the role of these as archival facts, as things that you create in the archive.
Well, I mean, I don't remember reading any documents that regard the Ottomans as the protectors of the ancient monuments.
No, I meant themselves. I didn't mean that the Ottomans, but themselves. So Canning was the protector or portrayed himself as the protector.
Know
what is happening right now?
Oh, yeah, there's this noise.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it's okay. It was just a thought we could. I just wanted to drop it as a kind of potential thought in the discussion, and just kind of emphasize the fact that these documents perform different roles beyond the information content. So,
could I?
Yeah, Elizabeth, of course. Yeah.
Could I just go back to something that Shukru said in his paper, and bring in the amazing Ottoman map of the Acropolis that's been shown. It was a part of the website, that picture, since no one's really talked about it. No, I think the Dimitris actually mentioned it briefly. As you said, there are parallel narratives going on. It's as if Canning, I mean, the British and the French are talking at the Ottomans are talking, they're not actually hearing each other, because I mean, that's part of our questioning. Do they have a way to even hear each other, what they're saying? And on that map, it's so fascinating that in the text and in the map, they refer to a lot of buildings as monasteries. The rocks of the monasteries, isn't that right, Shukru? I mean, Rashid, he mentioned, so of course, that is an old Arab tradition in Arabic and in the Ottoman tradition. Whenever there's an ancient pre-Islamic building that's impressive, you call it a monastery. So even that would have been it's like talking past then the French language. And I suppose the real question, part of what you're asking is, to what extent were these parties even interested in communicating? Right? To what extent, and are we going to be recreating a dialogue that didn't even exist?
Yeah, yeah.
In a way, didn't want to talk to each other.
Yeah, maybe they were creating facts on the ground for posterity, right? Here is an archival fact that can be, used as a kind of evidence that we were there to protect the Acropolis from the barbarian Turks.
Yes, exactly. In lieu of any sort of conversation, you didn't really want a conversation. You wanted to create on the ground a dialogue, an assertion.
Yeah. So we are open.
Days actually.
So go ahead, yeah.
This contemporary era, I find the early 19th century very similar to our times. There are many similarities. I wrote an article about this, which was published in the Katimerini. Anyway, so there is no dialogue even now between the barbaric Turkey of Erdogan and the civilized westernized European Union, which Greece is a part of it.
Yes. But we have a dialogue, Shukru. Here we have a dialogue. So
we do have a dialogue, and Ottoman documents show us that some Ottomans had dialogue with some Greeks back during the Greek Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
But these do not change the big narrative.
Yeah.
But you don't really have to change the narrative. All you have to do is basically to make the claim, to claim that you are the protector. This is a very strong concept, that I am the protector for both Islamic and Christian past. I am protecting something. I am the one who moves forward to protect it in a way, from the uncivilized for them or for those who don't really understand what this is all about, regardless if this is the case or whether this is the case or not. But they are protecting something. They need to protect something, the Brits in that case.
I'm very keen. I want to open it up to our audience. So I would like to ask anyone who wants to ask a question, and do it either by chat here on Zoom or by chat at YouTube, or even raise their hand, and if they're confident enough, they can switch on their mic and pose a question to all of us, to the panel, to speakers. I think Bruce Clark wants to ask a question to Shukru. Bruce, you want to switch on your microphone?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Yes. Good. Shukru, you've told us, you've illuminated, as it were, the Ottoman perspective on the fighting over the Acropolis. There is also a whole Greek narrative over fighting on the Acropolis. The treachery of Androutsos, the captivity of Androutsos, the dialogue between Makrianis and Gouras and so on, the Song of Makrianis. Do you find any convergence at all between the Greek narratives and the Ottoman narratives? Do they fit together in any sense?
Well, the official Greek narrative tries to absolve Androutsos of all of his so-called treachery.
Okay.
Right? It never mentions about his kapaki with the Ottomans. But I, however, found several documents in the Ottoman archives and published them in the Ottoman Athens volume. Androutsos was extremely desperate about the situation, and during the so-called Second Civil War. And most probably his allegiance to the Greek Revolution as an Albanian was not that sound. And he decided to side with the Ottomans. So one British account, his brother-in-law actually, says Androutsos made this deal with the Ottomans to save some time, to gain some time. However, we have Ottoman documents which prove that he made the Albanian villages and towns in the Attica region to surrender their arms and to accept Ottoman subjecthood again. Right.
Okay, thank you, Shukru. I think we have another question from Yorgos Kyriakou. Yorgos, would you like to switch on your mic to pose the question yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been really interesting. Shukru, it gives me this sense that the whole protection of the antiquities is a pretext, because it is used within a framework of politics negotiation. So they assume the role of protector or a potential destroyer as an accusation. But then when the time comes that there's a conflict, nobody has actually any regard to the material culture, because the situ translates into a citadel that takes part in an ongoing battle. So they would bombard it then with disregard to actual damage that they could do. So I'm just thinking that these documents are kind of lead us to a way to analyze maybe potential proof of the existence of a narrative where they just pretend to care about the past, but actually it's the colonization of the West against the Ottomans, and it's also used. The past is purely used as a symbolic capital in political engagement. I don't know if
so we are going to publish a huge volume with the Laskaridis Foundation. In it, you can see many orders sent to Reşit Pasha, urging him to give an end to the rebellion of the Greek Reaya, right? And do anything it takes. Because Reşit Pasha's head was, dangling over his shoulders because of this issue. I mean, the Pashas who proved unsuccessful were either losing their heads or their patrimony. So I don't believe that none of the Ottoman administrators give a damn about the ancient monuments or the Acropolis. What they wanted was to give an end to the Greek Revolution. And so the documents say we don't need to make a big deal of them. There is no need to come up with big theories about these documents.
If you allow me to interrupt you, because I think I didn't get my message across. Mainly, I don't present the question towards the Ottomans. It's mostly towards the Westerners, whereas they pretend to care about the ancient civilization because of all it entangles in the European identity of the time now. But if we see them clearly through these discussions that they have between them, I actually got the feeling, that nobody really cares about that. This is purely symbolic capital that is used in a power play of geopolitics. Yeah. I think it clearly shows that geopolitics are more important than the past itself, and the past is an identity. But when it comes to securing the geopolitical stature of a colonizing power, then that symbolic capital just remains at that, because you don't bombard like Morosini did, you don't bombard the Acropolis. If you really care about the Parthenon, you wouldn't bombard it in theory, right? But if we go back in time, I think that these documents clearly show, because there is a dialogue there. So that dialogue, I think it emphasizes the symbolic capital of the past being used purely for politics. And I think it strips away a little bit of this identity towards the classical past. It puts a limit to where the Western civilization at the time regarded the past as purely their identity, because when it comes to power structure, then they disregard that identity partially. I don't know if I'm making any point. I'll close it here because I'm chatting.
Yorgo, I think it's more of a comment, more of a kind of an expression of. I don't know whether Shukru wants to say something.
Very good point, and I could also add that to the geopolitical aspect of your comment. Until early 1826, most European powers backed the Sublime Porte, either directly, like Austria, or indirectly by remaining silent or indifferent or impartial. I mean, we have documents proving that the British waited very patiently the Sublime Porte to suppress the Greek Revolution until they couldn't wait anymore. And that point was the Russian intervention, right?
Thank you, Shukru. I think we have, I'm looking at the time and we have a couple of more questions, so I'm sorry to cut this response short. But we have a question from Suna Chagaptai. Suna, do you want to open your mic and pose the question to Dimitri?
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, everyone. Dimitri, I was curious whether the cemetery in Athens, does it have like any overlapping qualities with the ancient or the Byzantine cemetery in the city? Do we know anything about that? I don't recall where the cemetery was located.
I haven't studied this thing, so I cannot say anything for the time being. There is a small church, or there was a small church, I have to say, in the vicinity of the Ottoman cemetery, but again in a distance away from the burials, the Ottoman burials. Other than that, I don't know now. And the other part of your question is, yeah?
Were there any Byzantine or classical buildings reused as mausolea for the Ottomans? Or like
no, none of these buildings that were depicted in the engravings survived nowadays, so we cannot really tell. The Teke used, it seems that the Teke used some older material, the columns for sure, the capitals of the columns, but you cannot really tell. Other engravings depict the columns as they are made of wood, simple wooden things. And only the Tower of the Winds was used by dervishes after the 1740s. And this is not in the area of the cemetery.
I have one last question, very brief. May I ask, or?
Yes, go ahead briefly, yeah.
Since in Turkey, we have this practice of using the Catholic or Orthodox or Jewish tombstones as construction material under the Turkish Republic. I was curious whether some of the tombstones that you showed, whether they pop up anywhere in Athens or in general in Greece. Have they been reused in the 20th century or late 19th century?
Exactly. I think that they were used as building material for houses. And this I know because I made several visits to the Archaeological Service buildings. And then not the first, after a year, I visited again, and they mentioned, we have new material for you, an archaeologist told me, because they made the restoration of an older building and they found such a stone walled as polia. So they removed it and they took it away. And this is how I managed to take a picture of it. So yes, new material comes from time to time from these buildings.
Okay, thank you so much, Dimitri, and everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
We have a question for Tassos by Alessandro Camis.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, your lecture. It's amazing, because we have been all taught about the Parthenon, but that sequence of transformation. And the reason why the Acropolis is still there is because it was incorporated into other buildings in the Frankish area and so on. So otherwise that would have been, reused as building material. But at a certain point, you mentioned that the palace that was in different phases built on the northern side of the Propylaea is Florentine Palace. So I'm questioning, why would you mention Florentine? Basically, what is amazing of that transformation is the incorporation of the pediment and the colonnade into the facade of the palace. As maybe the earliest example of this practice that then will become canonical in neoclassical architecture. But the sequence, the laboratory of putting together, medieval, classical, starts there all the way to Schinkel's project for the transformation of the Acropolis into the palace of Otto, the King Otto. So why did you mention Florentine Palace?
Well, because the last was by the Florentines, and this was the most extensive. And it was Palazzo La Quattrocento. I mean, the first residents in the Propylea must have belonged to the Orthodox Metropolitan of Athens. And then when the de la Roche, the French Franks, because for the Greeks, all the Westerners were Franks at the time. So they occupied the Acropolis and the Athens and the Acropolis in 1204, and they made a palace in the northern wing of the Propylea, and they added a floor and added also a kind of chapel. All this was used also by the Catalans who followed. And then in the 15th century, the Acciaioli, sometime in the second quarter, most probably of the century, extended the palatial area into the central building and floor on the top. And I think I have published an article on that, that this was the model for a famous villa, the first pedimented villa on a flat wall without projection, which is the Poggio Acaiano. It was designed by the, how to say, the classicist or archaeological antique architect par excellence of the Renaissance, Giuliano da San Gallo, and maybe Lorenzo il Magnifico contributed to the design. And then this gave the, I mean, this preceded the later villas with pediments and on flat facades, and later with porticos all around, like the Palladian villas, let's say, those things. Yes, was the first. And I have written an article in Art Bulletin of Art, if you want to see that. So you were right, your remark was on the point.
Thank you, Tasso. I think we have a next question by Artun Özgüner. Artun, do you want to?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to all speakers. These are brilliant presentations, and thanks for this brilliant initiative as well. I have a question that regards to all of the speakers, and I'm afraid it's a pretty much general question. I don't know if it would make sense, but I guess I'm really curious about what constitutes public identity. For instance, let's talk about early 19th century. I guess from today's perspective, it's really easy to understand what makes someone a Greek or what makes someone a Turkish person. But how do we understand those identities in early 19th century? What makes a person Greek, or what makes a person a Turk or an Ottoman? Are there any overlaps? Is it really that black and white as we see it today? And for instance, what happens when we talk about local identities? And I guess this relates to one of the presentations that I'm terribly sorry I forgot whose presentation that was, that Athens population was majorly ethnically Albanian, but there were discrepancies between that religiously, the religious constitution of that population. So how do we understand those identities, maybe as early as 19th century?
Thank you, Artun. Of course, this is a huge issue.
It is,
and
yeah, I know.
A lot written on it, and because of the extensive debate on the bicentenary of the Greek War, there's now lots and lots of new books coming out on this. But I would like to ask our speakers if any of them would like to say something on this. On how do we understand?
If I can jump.
Sorry.
Can I jump in? Can I?
Yes, Konstantinos, go ahead.
It's not black and white at all. Yes, we do have local identities. We are very well aware of local identities, especially after the Greek War of Independence and after the state, the formation of the Greek state. Particularly, we know about Crete and the Peloponnese because we have work of reference for these two areas. I'm not all that sure what's there out about Athens, but it's definitely not black and white. And we do have written testimonies and material.
Thank you.
Any other speaker who would like to say something? Tasso? Oh, sorry, Elizabeth first, and then Tassos.
Just briefly, the question really, what sort of material can we look at to answer this question, to begin to give multiple answers? And one thing that I think the various research projects looking at is how to analyze the complex material culture of this period in Greece or on the other side of the Aegean. How do we, there's some very interesting work happening now about how we classify. You know, you have the same motifs in, we're having a workshop in a year's time on embroideries. You know, where do you make these divisions, and who is doing the classifying? Are they archaeologists, or are they the women who would make them themselves? So these, looking at different materials, looking at collections of coins, looking at, you know, questions of classifying, I think are very important, because also this period you're talking about is the rise of folklore. How, so in the study of folklore, I mean, Yannis has written a lot about this, but these different, to try to focus on the different sources that we choose, but also people would choose to define themselves. Yeah, I think that's what's really important about this idea of getting a collaborative work going, thinking about what we can do.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Tasso? Tasso, you need to unmute.
I'm not a specialist at all, of course, but from my readings, because I had to read history, let's say, I remember that it was not the Greek identity by Hellenas came after the establishment of the modern Greek state. So the Greeks, when they went to the parts which now, areas which now belong to Greece, they were Hellenes, but the locals were Romni. And it is mainly this difference which differentiated, let's say, Turks and Greeks, and it was Romnios. And Romnios, I think, was a Greek-speaking and Orthodox. This is my understanding from my readings about identities in late Byzantine.
Yeah.
So maybe, what survived until the end. Yes. Sorry, I'm finished.
Thank you, Tasso. I mean, it's a big question, as I said, but let's not forget that the main organizing principle was religion, and that during the war, especially, it was actually Christians against Muslims, at least in the pronouncements, because, of course, on the ground, as many of our panelists have shown, things were more complicated. So you may have, both Christians and Muslims on both sides, especially if you insert ethnicity in it, and if you insert the issue of, as you said, Albanian kind of people from different Albanian kind of tribal ethnicities. But this is a big issue, and I think there's a lot you could say. Because we are running out of time, I wanted to ask if there are any other questions from chat or Constantine on YouTube chat. Otherwise, we should wrap it up.
We have a very interesting question by Alison Grenda here on the chat. Do
you want to read it out? Or?
Yeah. Basically, it's a question of how to incorporate into the current Acropolis Museum and other sites for visitors that Ottoman narrative, and is it possible to create a more didactic display? I find this question very pertinent to decolonize Hellas, so that's why I wanted to bring it out. Yeah.
Okay. I have a lot to say on this, but I wanted to ask if any of the panelists want to say something before me.
I spoke about that, so you have to go on.
And Elizabeth also said a few things. Look, I think we have talking about parallel narratives, we have another parallel narrative here, our own narrative, and also the narrative of many specialists who have started working together and who have started recreating the Entangled biographies of the Acropolis And then we have the official narrative, the narrative of institutions, of the Ministry of Culture, and the narrative, unfortunately, of the new museum, which is still a narrative of the late 18th and 19th century. Still a narrative of nationalism, a narrative of Eurocentrism as well. But I think we should continue our job. They have their job to do, we have our job to do. I don't expect any of them to listen to what I've said tonight and rush tomorrow and recreate the Acropolis Museum. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But what we are doing here, I think, is of value, and people are listening, and people are actually understanding that things are much more complicated. So I'm hopeful. I think our initiative, many other initiatives are working towards that direction. So things are changing, maybe slowly, maybe gradually, but I think things are changing. And the new, the other Acropolises in plural is emerging, not only in academic papers and books, but also in people's understanding and people's kind of perceptions. I mean, there are many other ideas we could explore. And in fact, one of the questions we posed to our speakers is, how else can we actually raise these issues? I know that our initiative, Decolonize hellάş, is planning a series of anti-tours, a series of tours of the Acropolis, where some of these things can be shown on the ground, at least with the use of some audio or visual material. Another idea is to create an alternative guide of the Acropolis that can be actually found online, and can be found in other kind of media, can be downloaded, and people can go and see in different localities what was there before the project of purification took hold of the area. There are many more, so please write to us, please suggest other ideas, because this is an ongoing project. Is there anything else that we could add, or perhaps we should say another round of thanks? First of all, to our speakers for 4 wonderful presentations. Second, to our audience. We had many people joining us here on Zoom and on YouTube. And this is going to be of lasting value, because the video is going to be soon available on YouTube for people to watch. And then, of course, to the organizing, supporting institutions, Decolonize hellάş, the Decolonial Initiative, and the people who actually made this possible, including Natalia from Decolonize hellάş, including Anna from the Lab of Borders and Gender at the University of Macedonia. Konstantinos, I don't know whether I've forgotten anyone else.
You've included everything, anyone.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a long, but I think very interesting session. So good night, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Yannis. Bye.
Thank you.